The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing the implosion of my entire world. Barren, my husband Richard spat the word like a curse. His voice, usually so smooth and dripping with condescending charm, was a blade of ice in the opulent ballroom. I have tolerated your uselessness for 5 years. 5 years of a fruitless marriage to a barren woman. He didn't just say it to me. He announced it to the assembled elite of our city, his mother Beatrice, nodding beside him with a look of venomous satisfaction. My own family, my father and stepmother, stood a few feet away, their faces a carefully constructed mask of pity that did nothing to hide their relief. My younger stepsister, Clara, clung to Richard's arm, her eyes gleaming with a triumph she barely tried to conceal. This was my fifth wedding anniversary party, a grand affair Richard had insisted upon. Now I knew why. It wasn't a celebration, it was an execution. He gestured to Clara, her hand possessively on his chest. "Clara is with child," he declared, a cruel smile twisting his handsome features. "My child. An heir, something you could never give me." The gasps were audible, a wave of shock and scandal rippling through the guests. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. I looked at Clara, my own sister, who had always been the golden child, the one my stepmother doted on while I was treated as little more than a servant in my own home. I saw no guilt in her eyes, only smug victory. My world narrowed to their triumphant faces, the glittering chandeliers blurring into a meaningless smear of light. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over me. I was nothing, a discarded, broken thing. He had not only divorced me in front of everyone we knew, but he had also branded me, erased any hope for my future. Little did he know, a secret bloomed within me, a truth that would one day bring his gilded world crashing down around him. My life had always been a lesson in being second best, or rather, not being in the running at all. My mother died when I was 5, and my father, a man who measured worth in social connections and financial gain, remarried within a year. My stepmother, Eleanor, came with her own daughter, Clara, who was my age. From that day on, my own home became a foreign land where I was an unwelcome guest. Eleanor was a master of subtle cruelty, her words dripping with a sweet poison that eroded my confidence day by day. "Oh, Elara, darling, that dress just doesn't hang on you the way it does on Clara. You have your mother's sturdy frame." Or, "It's best if Clara speaks to the guests, dear. You have a tendency to be so intense." Clara learned from the best. She was the sun around which my family orbited. She was beautiful, charming, and effortlessly cruel. She'd steal my ideas for school projects and present them as her own, earning accolades while I received disappointed looks from my father. She'd borrow my favorite things, only for them to turn up broken or stained. When I complained, my father would sigh, exasperated. "Alara, can't you just try to get along? You're making things so difficult for your mother." My existence was an inconvenience, a reminder of a first wife he was all too eager to forget. My only solace was my grandmother on my mother's side, a warm, loving woman who saw the light in me that my own family tried so hard to extinguish. But she lived across the country, and her visits were infrequent. Her influence limited by distance and Eleanor's constant interference. When I met Richard at a university gala, I thought my life was finally changing. He was the heir to the formidable Blackwood fortune, impossibly handsome, and he showered me with an attention I had never known. He seemed to see past the quiet, overlooked girl I was forced to be at home. He made me feel seen, cherished even. My family was ecstatic. It was a brilliant match, not for me, but for them. The marriage would elevate their social standing, forge a powerful alliance with the Blackwoods. I was a pawn in their game, a transactional asset. I was so desperate for love and acceptance that I ignored the red flags. The way his eyes would go cold when I disagreed with him, the possessive grip on my arm, the subtle digs at my intelligence disguised as jokes. I mistook control for care and possession for passion. The wedding was a society event, more for my family and the Blackwoods than for me. I was a doll, dressed and posed for pictures. And once the vows were said, the mask began to slip. The charming man I thought I had married was replaced by a cold, demanding stranger. My life became a cage, albeit a gilded one. Richard and his mother Beatrice were a united front. Beatrice was a woman carved from ice, who viewed me as nothing more than a vessel for the next Blackwood heir. In her eyes, my sole purpose was to produce a son. The first year was filled with passive-aggressive comments about my duty. "A woman's greatest achievement is her children," she would say over dinner, her eyes boring into me. "Don't you agree, Alara?" The second year, the pressure mounted. Monthly appointments with fertility specialists became a mandatory ritual. I was poked, prodded, and subjected to a battery of humiliating tests. Richard was never tested. The assumption was absolute. If there was a problem, it was with me. The doctors found nothing wrong, but that didn't matter to the Blackwoods. The verdict had already been passed. I was failing. Richard grew more distant, his evenings spent at the office or at business dinners. I later realized those were euphemisms for his time with Clara. She had started visiting our home under the guise of supporting me. Her eyes filled with false sympathy as she watched my marriage crumble. She was a snake I had welcomed into my garden, and all along she was poisoning the roots. My stepmother would call, her voice laced with feigned concern. "Are you taking your vitamins, dear? Perhaps you're too stressed. Clara never gets stressed. You should try to be more like your sister." The narrative was solidifying, a wall of blame closing in around me. I was defective, unworthy, barren. The words started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a seed of doubt planted by their relentless campaign. Then it became a roar. I started to believe it myself. My sense of self-worth, already fragile from years of my family's neglect, shattered completely. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, my only purpose unfulfilled, my existence a disappointment. The only flicker of light in those dark years came from an unexpected source. About a year before the disastrous anniversary party, I attended a royal charity auction. Richard had a last-minute business trip, another lie, I'm sure, and sent me as his proxy. I was miserable, navigating the glittering crowd alone, feeling their pitying stares. I escaped to a secluded palace garden to catch my breath, the scent of night-blooming jasmine a balm to my frayed nerves. That's where I met him, Crown Prince Alistair. He wasn't what I expected. There was no air of arrogance about him, only a quiet strength and a surprising gentleness in his eyes. He found me crying silently on a stone bench. He didn't pry or offer platitudes. He simply sat beside me and spoke of the stars, of the history of the garden, his calm voice a steady anchor in my storm of despair. We talked for hours. For the first time in years, I felt like a person, not just a wife or a potential mother. I told him nothing of my troubles, but he seemed to understand anyway. There was an unspoken empathy between us, a connection that felt ancient and profound. We met again, secretly, a few more times over the following months. Our meetings were innocent, stolen moments of conversation in quiet cafes or hidden corners of art galleries. He was my friend, my only friend. He listened. He made me laugh. He reminded me of the woman I used to be, the one buried under years of abuse and expectation. Our last meeting was about 2 months before the party. It was a rainy afternoon, and we found shelter in a small, forgotten library. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and rain. The quiet intimacy, the shared warmth, the deep-seated loneliness in both of us. Something shifted. We didn't plan it. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a desperate reach for comfort in a world that had offered us so little. It was a single, perfect afternoon that I locked away in my heart, a secret I thought I would carry with me to my grave. It was a bittersweet memory, a glimpse of a life I could never have. A few days later, I started feeling unwell, the exhaustion, the nausea. I dismissed it as stress. How could I even entertain the hope? I was barren. Everyone knew it. The doctor's vague assurances meant nothing against the certainty of my husband and his family. I was broken, and then came the party. Standing in the ruins of my life, Richard's cruel words ringing in my ears, something inside me shifted. The years of pain and humiliation coalesced not into despair, but into a cold, hard diamond of rage. As my family and my soon-to-be ex-husband celebrated their victory, a strange calm washed over me. The nausea I had been feeling for weeks suddenly felt different. It wasn't the sickness of stress. It was something else, a tiny, persistent flutter deep within me, a secret hope I hadn't dared to acknowledge. While they toasted their future, I made a silent vow to my own. This was not the end. This was the beginning. They thought they had destroyed me, but they had only set me free. And I would use that freedom to build a life so magnificent that their pathetic little world would seem like a speck of dust in comparison. My revenge wouldn't be loud or immediate. It would be my success, my survival. And the secret I carried, the secret that might just be a miracle, would be my ultimate weapon. The days following the public humiliation were a blur of legalities and forced solitude. Richard, eager to finalize his new life with Clara, ensured the divorce was swift and brutal. I was given a small, insulting settlement, just enough to ensure I wouldn't starve immediately, and cast out of the life I had known. My father and Eleanor didn't even call. They had their prize, a connection to the Blackwood heir through Clara's child. I was a loose end, neatly tied and discarded. I moved into a small, anonymous apartment on the other side of the city, a place where no one knew the name Elara Blackwood, the Barren wife. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. And it was in that solitude, away from the suffocating judgment of my family, that the tiny flutter of hope grew into a certainty. 2 weeks after the divorce was final, I sat on the edge of my new, unfamiliar bed, staring at the positive pregnancy test in my shaking hand. It wasn't just one test. It was 5, all positive. A wave of emotions so powerful it nearly knocked me breathless washed over me. Terror, disbelief, and then a fierce, overwhelming joy. I wasn't barren, I was pregnant. The timing was undeniable. This child, this miracle, was not Richard's. It was Alistair's. The secret I had buried so deep, the memory of one perfect rainy afternoon, had borne fruit. My first instinct was panic. The Crown Prince's child? The scandal would be cataclysmic. I could be ruined, my child's life turned into a political spectacle. But then the rage returned, cold and clarifying. Richard, Beatrice, Clara, my own family. They had built their happiness on the lie of my brokenness. They had branded me, shamed me, and cast me aside. And all along I was carrying a secret that could shatter their world. A secret that proved I wasn't the failure they had declared me to be. It was in that moment, sitting in that sterile apartment with 5 plastic sticks confirming my miracle, that I made my choice. I would not be a victim anymore. I would not hide in shame. This child, these children, as I would later find out, was not a scandal. They were my vindication. My plan began to form, not as a detailed blueprint, but as a guiding principle. I would protect my children, and I would build a life for us far from the toxicity of my past. The first step was survival. I used the meager settlement to invest in myself. I had always had a talent for art, specifically for restoring delicate antiques, a skill I'd inherited from my grandmother and nurtured in secret. It was the one thing that was truly mine, a passion Richard had dismissed as a quaint little hobby. I found a small workshop, a dusty, forgotten place, and poured my heart and soul into it. I worked tirelessly, my growing belly a constant reminder of who I was fighting for. My hands, once soft and manicured for society events, became calloused and stained with varnish, and I had never been happier. The second part of my plan was more complex. I needed to let Alistair know, not for his help, not yet. I needed to do this myself. But he deserved to know he was going to be a father. He was a good man, a man of honor. I couldn't keep this from him. Getting a message to the Crown Prince without alerting the palace's legion of secretaries and security was nearly impossible. So I used my art. I knew the royal palace was looking to restore a series of antique tapestries from the late dynasty. It was a highly specialized skill, and I spent weeks researching the specific techniques, practicing on scraps until my fingers bled. I submitted a portfolio under a pseudonym, E. Vance, using my mother's maiden name. I poured all my knowledge, all my passion into the proposal. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. My business was slowly growing. I had a few clients who appreciated my meticulous work. I was making enough to get by, to buy baby clothes and dream of a future. I had almost given up on the palace proposal when the letter arrived, embossed with the royal crest. My proposal had been chosen. I was to report to the palace curator for a preliminary meeting. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it, the turning point. I wasn't just Ilara, the Barren wife, anymore. I was E. Vance, the skilled artisan who had earned her way into the heart of the kingdom. And I was walking back into the world that had cast me out, not as a victim, but as a creator, with a royal secret hidden in plain sight. Walking through the gilded gates of the royal palace felt like stepping into another dimension. The last time I'd been here, I was Richard Blackwood's wife, a decorative accessory on the arm of a powerful man. I felt small then, insignificant. Now I walked alone, my portfolio clutched in my hand, my belly gently rounded beneath a simple but elegant dress. I was E. Vance, a professional. There was a power in that anonymity, a freedom in being judged on my talent alone. The head curator, a stern but fair man named Mr. Abernathy, grilled me on my techniques. He was impressed. I had earned my place here. As the weeks passed, I worked diligently in a private studio within the palace, meticulously restoring the faded threads of the ancient tapestries. It was quiet, peaceful work, and it gave me time to think. I occasionally saw Alistair from a distance, a fleeting glimpse of him in a formal procession or walking in the gardens. We never spoke. I knew it was better that way, for now. My presence here was a ticking clock. I had to choose my moment carefully. The moment came unexpectedly. I was 6 months along, my pregnancy becoming more difficult to hide. I was working late one evening when Alistair entered the studio. He hadn't been announced. He was dressed informally, his usual princely bearing replaced by a weary exhaustion. He said he often came to this wing of the palace to escape the pressures of his duties. He didn't recognize me at first. I was just E. Vance, the restorer. He admired my work, his fingers gently tracing the vibrant colors I had brought back to life. "You have a remarkable gift," he said, his voice the same calm anchor I remembered from that rainy day. "Thank you, Your Highness," I replied, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. He turned to look at me properly then, and I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. His gaze dropped from my face to my swollen belly. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of our breathing. I didn't need to say a word, he knew. I saw a kaleidoscope of emotions flash across his face. Shock, confusion, and then something that looked like dawning wonder. He took a step closer. "Ilara?" he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "Is it?" I simply nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "Yes," I said softly. He didn't react with anger or fear. He didn't accuse me of being an opportunist. He closed the remaining distance between us and gently, so gently, placed his hand on my belly. A jolt like lightning passed between us. At that exact moment, one of the babies kicked, a tangible little thump against his palm. Alistair's eyes widened and a slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "A strong one," he murmured. "I knew it," he said, looking back at me, his eyes shining. "I knew there was something more between us than just a stolen afternoon. I felt it." In that moment, everything I had feared, the scandal, the judgment, the political fallout, melted away. I wasn't alone anymore. He listened intently as I recounted the story of the past few months. The devastating party, the divorce, the discovery of the pregnancy, my decision to build a new life for myself. I explained that I hadn't come for money or a title, only to let him know the truth. He listened without interruption, his expression hardening when I spoke of Richard and my family. When I finished, he took my hands in his. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did all of this on your own, but you don't have to be on your own anymore. These are my children too, and I will not abandon them, or you." The plan we formulated together was far bolder than anything I could have managed alone. Alistair would not deny his children. We would not hide. But we would choose the time and place for the reveal. He arranged for me to move from my cramped apartment into a discreet but beautiful private villa on the outskirts of the city, complete with staff and security. He wanted me and the babies to be safe and comfortable. He visited every day, his initial wonder growing into a deep, tender affection. We fell into a comfortable rhythm, two people bound by a miracle, slowly, cautiously falling in love. We talked for hours, not just about the babies, but about everything. I learned about the pressures he faced, the loneliness of his position. He learned about the woman I was beneath the scars of my past. Meanwhile, the city's gossip mills were churning. Claire's pregnancy was the talk of the town. She and Richard were positioned as the new power couple. They were photographed at every high society event, Clara glowing, Richard looking smug and proud. My family was basking in their reflected glory. They had never been more influential. They believed I had simply disappeared, a pathetic creature who had crawled away to lick her wounds in obscurity. They had no idea the storm that was gathering. My due date was approaching. Alistair and I planned a small private christening for the babies about a month after their birth. The guest list would be small but significant, including the king and queen and a few trusted members of the royal court. The invitations went out. And then, Alistair did something brilliant. He sent a special invitation to Richard and Clara Blackwood and to my father and stepmother. The invitation was not for a christening. It was for a special royal announcement at the Palace Chapel, a must-attend event for the city's most prominent families. Their egos would never allow them to decline. They would walk into that chapel expecting to be honored. They had no idea they were walking into their own public execution. The stage was set. The players were in position. The quiet artisan was ready to reveal her masterpiece. The day of the christening was bright and clear, a perfect autumn afternoon. I stood in a private chamber off the main chapel, looking at my reflection. The woman staring back was someone I barely recognized. The haunted, broken creature from that anniversary party was gone. In her place was a woman radiating a quiet confidence, dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored cream-colored gown that did nothing to hide the soft curves of new motherhood. In my arms, I held my son, Leo, and in a bassinet beside me, my daughter, Serena, slept soundly. They were perfect. They had Alistair's deep blue eyes and a dusting of my dark hair. They were my world, my victory, my everything. Alistair entered the room, already dressed in his formal royal attire. He stopped when he saw us. The look on his face was one of pure adoration. He came and kissed my forehead, then gently stroked the cheeks of our sleeping children. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. "I am," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It's time." We could hear the murmur of voices from the chapel as the guests arrived. Through a small, screened window, I watched them file in. There was Richard, looking smug and important in his tailored suit, with Clara on his arm. Her own baby was due in a few months, and she wore her pregnancy like a trophy. My father and Eleanor were preening, greeting other guests with an air of ownership, as if they belonged in these hallowed halls. They sat in the front pew, reserved for the most esteemed guests, their faces alight with greedy anticipation. They thought this announcement was about them, some new honor or business venture connected to the crown. The irony was so thick I could taste it. When the king and queen entered, a hush fell over the chapel. The ceremony began. Alistair walked to the front and stood beside the royal font. He looked out at the assembled guests, his gaze calm and commanding. He let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice echoing in the sacred space. "I have gathered you here today to share news of the greatest joy I have ever known. Several months ago, a great blessing was bestowed upon the royal family. A blessing I have kept private until now to protect those I hold most dear." He paused, and the anticipation in the room was palpable. I saw Richard lean forward, a confused frown on his face. Clara looked bored, already certain this had nothing to do with her. "Today," Alistair continued, his voice ringing with pride, "I would like to introduce you to my children, the heirs to the throne." He turned and looked directly at the chamber door. It swung open, and I stepped out into the light, Leo in my arms. A royal nurse followed, carrying Serena. A collective gasp swept through the chapel. The silence that followed was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of shock. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the aisle, my gaze fixed forward. I didn't look at them, not yet. I walked to Alistair's side and turned to face the crowd. I finally allowed myself to look at them. Richard's face was a mask of utter disbelief. His jaw was slack, his skin had turned a pasty white. He stared at the baby in my arms, then at my face, then back again, his mind clearly unable to process what he was seeing. Beside him, Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The color drained from her face, her smugness replaced by a dawning, sickening realization. My father looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, and Eleanor's perfectly painted smile had frozen and cracked. "This is Alara," Alistair said, his hand resting protectively on my back. "And these are our children, Prince Leo and Princess Serena." "That's impossible!" The shout came from Richard. He stumbled to his feet, his voice a ragged croak. "She's Barren. The woman is Barren." He pointed a trembling finger at me, his composure shattering completely. "It's a trick, a lie." The king rose from his seat, his expression thunderous. "Mr. Blackwood, you will hold your tongue in this sacred place." But Richard was beyond reason. His world was collapsing in on him. "That child can't be his. It's probably mine. She's a deceitful, lying—" "Enough." Alistair's voice was low and deadly, cutting through Richard's frantic ranting. He gestured to the royal guards. "Mr. Blackwood is creating a disturbance. Perhaps he and his family would be more comfortable waiting outside." But before the guards could move, I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the chapel. "He's right about one thing," I said, looking directly at Richard. "The children aren't yours. They couldn't be. The doctor's reports from all those fruitless fertility appointments, the ones Richard had insisted upon for me but refused for himself, had been delivered to the palace that morning." Alistair's chief of staff now stepped forward and handed a file to the king. Alistair addressed the crowd again. "For years, Ilara was subjected to a cruel and relentless campaign of emotional abuse, based on the false claim that she was unable to have children. She was publicly shamed and abandoned by her husband and her family." His gaze swept over my father, Eleanor, and Clara, who were now shrinking in their pew, the eyes of everyone in the room burning into them. "The truth is, Mr. Blackwood is the one who is sterile, a medical fact his pride would never allow him to accept." The final blow. A gasp, louder this time, rippled through the guests. It wasn't just a scandal, it was an utter demolition. Richard stared, his face a grotesque canvas of rage and humiliation. Clara began to sob, not for Richard, but for herself, for the future she had just lost. The child she was carrying, the so-called Blackwood heir, was worthless. Her ticket to wealth and status had just been invalidated in the most public way imaginable. The guards escorted a stunned, incoherent Richard and a weeping Clara from the chapel. My father and Eleanor followed, their heads bowed, avoiding the disgusted and pitying stares of their peers. Their social climb was over. They were ruined, their names forever linked to this disgrace. As the heavy oak doors closed behind them, a sense of profound peace washed over me. It was done. The lies had been burned away by the truth. I looked at Alistair, and he smiled at me, a promise of our new beginning. I looked down at my son, so small and perfect in my arms. My revenge wasn't just in their destruction, it was in my creation. I had created this new life. I had created this new family. And it was more beautiful than anything I could have ever imagined. In the aftermath, the world realigned itself around our new reality. The story was everywhere, a modern-day fairy tale of a wronged woman and her triumphant return. But for me, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was just life, finally my own. The palace officially announced our betrothal, and our wedding was a quiet, intimate affair, a stark contrast to the hollow spectacle of my first. It was a celebration of love, not a merger of assets. Marrying Alistair felt like coming home. The king and queen, who had been horrified to learn of my past, welcomed me with open arms, not just as the mother of their grandchildren, but as a daughter. Life in the palace was an adjustment, but a joyful one. My days were no longer filled with anxiety and judgment, but with the happy chaos of two growing babies. Leo had Alistair's calm and steady nature, while Serena had a mischievous spark that was all her own. They were the center of my universe, a constant, beautiful reminder of how far I had come. My art studio was moved to a sun-drenched wing of the palace, and my work, now under my own name, became celebrated throughout the kingdom. I was no longer just a princess. I was a renowned artist, a woman of substance and talent in my own right. The Blackwoods as a dynasty imploded. The revelation of Richard's sterility and his public, unhinged display of cruelty led to a massive loss of confidence among his company's shareholders. He was forced to step down as CEO. The company, once a titan of industry, faltered and was eventually carved up and sold off by its creditors. Richard lost everything: his company, his reputation, his fortune. I heard through the grapevine that Clara gave birth to a son, but Richard, consumed by his own bitterness and humiliation, refused to acknowledge the child, still irrationally blaming her and me for his downfall. They divorced acrimoniously. Clara was left with nothing but a baby and a tarnished name, forced to move back in with our parents. My father and Eleanor became social pariahs. The world that had once fawned over them now turned its back. His business connections dried up, and they were forced to sell their mansion and retreat into a much smaller, quieter life, haunted by the specter of their public disgrace. I never spoke to them again. There was nothing left to say. Their punishment was to live with the consequences of their own cruelty, to watch from the distant sidelines as the daughter they had discarded thrived in a world they could no longer touch. One beautiful spring morning, a year after the christening, I was in the royal gardens with Alistair, watching Leo and Serena take their first wobbly steps on the soft grass. The sun was warm on my skin, and the air was filled with the scent of roses. Alistair wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Are you happy, my love?" he asked, his voice soft in my ear. I leaned back against him, a deep, contented sigh escaping my lips as I watched our children tumble and laugh. The memories of the pain, the humiliation, the loneliness, they were still there, but they no longer had any power over me. They were like faint scars from a battle long since won. "More than I ever thought possible," I whispered. I had been called useless, fruitless, barren. But here, in this garden, surrounded by love and laughter, I was the furthest thing from it. I had cultivated new life from the ashes of the old, a life more vibrant and full than I could have ever dreamed. The woman who was meant to have nothing now had everything, and it was a victory that was entirely, completely my own.